Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the peculiar world of Victorian bed warmers. Yes, actual tools for heating beds. Imagine it's midwinter, 1870, somewhere in Yorkshire. There's frost on the inside of your bedroom window. You're wearing 3 layers of wool and still contemplating whether hypothermia is a real risk or just an inevitable Tuesday. Your chamber pot's frozen. The dog's frozen. Honestly, you might be frozen. Welcome to the age before central heating. The bed, your one sanctuary, is a trap of icy sheets and goose-down betrayals. So you reach for the contraption hanging by the fireplace, a long-handled pan with a lid filled with hot coals or a heated brick. You slide it under the covers to coax the chill away. But will it work, or will you burn a hole in your only mattress? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere colder than a Victorian attic, let me know where you're watching from and the local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a scratchy flannel nightshirt, staring at the ceiling beams of a narrow Victorian bedroom. The first thing you feel isn't drowsiness, it's the cold. Not crisp cold. Not refreshing cold. But that hungry, creeping cold that seems to sniff around your ankles like a stray cat. Victorian bedrooms weren't heated. Fireplaces were mostly decorative or reserved for guests. Unless you were extremely wealthy, your home's only real warmth came from the hearth in the downstairs kitchen. The upstairs? A frozen tundra. People back then didn't just dislike the cold, they feared it. Not in a cozy, marshmallow jacket sort of way, but in the "this might kill me" sense. Pneumonia, pleurisy, and tuberculosis were common. And suspected to lurk in drafts. You could literally be struck down by a cold hallway. So bedrooms, while romanticized today, were battlefields against exposure. Enter the humble bed warmer. The earliest versions were simple: take a brick, heat it by the fire, wrap it in flannel, shove it under the covers. But eventually, metal pans with lids and long handles became the norm. You'd fill them with embers or coal, swirl them around your mattress, and hope for the best. They weren't always safe. Sometimes, people lit their mattresses on fire. Other times, the bed warmer left a neat little scorched outline, like a ghost had tried to leave a message. But there was also something oddly intimate about them. You didn't warm just anyone's bed. It was a service of affection or duty. A child's bed. A guest you wanted to impress. Or your own, if you had the time and stamina. One joke from the period had a man proposing marriage by saying, "I've warmed you a bedpan." Not exactly poetry. But sincere. Mainstream fact? The Victorian home averaged between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 degrees Fahrenheit indoors during winter. That's your inside temperature. That's why you're wearing mittens in bed. Quirky tidbit? Some people placed dried hops, cloves, or citrus peel inside the warming pan with the brick, for scent and warmth. Victorian bedrooms could smell like gingerbread or burnt laundry. Historians still argue whether people actually slept better because of these warmers, or just used them as a pre-sleep ritual. Did the temporary heat make a difference? Or was it a placebo wrapped in hot brass? And yet, if you lived through a Victorian January, you'd probably cling to any placebo you could get. Sometimes, children would fight over who got the hot corner of the bed first. The cooling brick was shuffled from side to side like a sleepy game of Pong. The one who lost? Shivered all night. Character building, they said. Character ruining, said everyone else. Then there was the noise. A coal-filled pan clanged like a cymbal if you jostled it. One wrong move, and your midnight warmth became a rude, echoing wake-up call. Still, people adapted. Your hands learned exactly how long to swirl the pan before it left marks. You developed a sixth sense for just warm enough. And there was something hypnotic about the ritual, the quiet clatter of pan on tile, the steam rising from cloth, the brief glow under linen sheets. Not every home used them. Some used bed bottles, ceramic or copper flasks filled with hot water, sealed with corks or screw tops. Safer, yes, but more prone to leaks. A leaky bed bottle didn't just ruin sleep, it ruined your only set of clean, dry sheets for the week. Of course, if you were poor, you didn't have fancy pans or bottles. You might just cuddle a baked potato. No, seriously. Some families roasted a potato and passed it around like a hot stone. You'd warm your fingers on it, maybe your face. And the best part? You got to eat it in the morning. Even Queen Victoria had her preferred warming devices, gold-plated and maid-handled, of course. But for most people, bed warming was less royal luxury, more sheer survival. And for every warm bed in Britain, there was at least one scorched one. Entire households learned the hard way that low and slow was the warming pan motto. Too fast, and you had cinders where your featherbed used to be. So now, as your flannel sheets begin to heat just slightly under the careful pressure of a well-twirled pan, you understand, warmth wasn't taken for granted. It was earned, coaxed, and briefly savored before vanishing into cold dawn. Tomorrow, you'll fight the frost again. But tonight, you've tamed it, just a little. The bed may be warm now, but don't get too cozy yet, there's a war happening under those starched cotton sheets. Not a loud one. Not a dramatic one. But a quiet, domestic battle made of gestures, sighs, and the occasional passive-aggressive bedmaking. You see, in the Victorian world, your bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a stage. A symbol. A subtle declaration of your values, your status, and, unfortunately, your hygiene. And the bed warmer? It was the match that lit this absurdly polite powder keg. In many middle-class households, bed warmers became a point of contention between spouses. Picture it, you want to preheat the bed because your toes have gone full frostbite chic, but your partner insists it's unnatural or unchristian to alter the climate God intended. Romantic, right? Airing out bedding each morning was practically a moral duty. Sunlight, people believed, chased away not just dampness but miasmas, invisible gases thought to carry disease. So adding moisture and heat to the mattress at night? To some Victorians, that was basically inviting cholera over for tea. There were also whispers, that warm beds could lead to warm thoughts. Yes, even that. One moralist publication from the 1850s subtly warned against overindulgent bed heat, claiming it might stimulate nerves in undesirable directions. Translation: warm feet equals wicked dreams. You can't help but smile at the idea that a cozy bed could unlock forbidden desires, but this was serious business back then. The line between comfort and moral decay was apparently measured in degrees Fahrenheit. Mainstream historical fact? Doctors like Florence Nightingale emphasized cold, dry air for health. Her famous nursing manual warned that excessive warmth in beds could weaken the constitution. She was basically the Victorian version of someone cracking a window open in December for circulation. Quirky tidbit? Some households had a designated bed warming hour in the evening, right before prayers. It was treated almost like brushing your teeth, a routine you followed even when nobody was visiting, just in case. Historians still argue whether this obsession with dry beds was about genuine health concerns or part of a larger cultural anxiety about the body. Was it about preventing illness, or policing pleasure? There's no firm answer, but the debate itself is oddly warming. Meanwhile, gender politics added another twist to this tangled linen. In upper-class homes, it was usually the housemaid's job to warm the beds. Not just anyone was trusted to slide hot coals under someone's eiderdown. It took training, finesse, and above all, discretion. If a maid scorched the sheets, or worse, left behind the faint smell of last night's supper, they could be reprimanded, or even dismissed. But in lower-income homes, where servants were rare luxuries, the task often fell to the woman of the house. It became a chore layered with symbolism. Warm the bed right, and you were caring. Fail, and you were negligent. But overdo it, and someone might call you indecent. Quite a tightrope, all for the crime of not wanting frostbite. Even more awkward? The bed warmer gift. Occasionally, a newlywed couple received a brand new warming pan as a wedding present. Sweet? Maybe. But it also whispered, "We know you'll be sharing heat. Don't burn the house down." It's a Victorian love letter in copper and coal dust. And speaking of house fires, let's not forget the literal danger. In some insurance records from the 1860s, bedpan fires are listed as an actual category of domestic incident. One case involved a groom who warmed the bed for his bride, left the pan in too long, and returned to find the mattress smoking like a London chimney. She wasn't thrilled. Still, despite the risks and judgment, people clung to their rituals. Some even decorated their warming pans. Engraved initials, floral patterns, or cozy brass inlays made these tools feel less like fire hazards and more like heirlooms. It's the equivalent of monogramming your space heater today, equal parts stylish and unnecessary. And yet, every night, across thousands of beds from Liverpool to Limerick, this drama played out. Would the bed be warm? Would it be too warm? Would someone get scolded? Or would everyone just pretend the pan hadn't left a giant copper ring on the pillowcase? Tonight, in your own imagination, you slide the warming pan carefully under the covers again. Not too long. Not too hot. Just a little warmth before sleep. You glance at the fire across the room, flickering low, and imagine generations before you, balancing comfort with propriety, one smoldering pan at a time. The battle of the bed continues, but for now, your side has won. The bed might be warming up nicely now, but let's step back for a moment. No, not out of the bed, don't worry, and wander into the strange economy that revolved around keeping these beds toasty in the first place. Because, as with most things in Victorian Britain, even warmth had a class system. You see, not everyone owned a fancy brass bed warmer. In fact, most people didn't. If you were poor, and in Victorian times, that was a lot of people, your bed warming options were delightfully, and sometimes dangerously, homemade. There were hot bricks wrapped in newspaper. Tin cans stuffed with smoldering hay. Even bottles filled with water heated on the stove, sealed with corks and dreams. And yes, the potato trick again, it wasn't a one-time gimmick, it was a lifestyle. One hot potato could do double duty as a bedtime heat source and a breakfast plan. You have to respect the efficiency. Now, if you were very poor, say living in a one-room flat with more drafts than walls, there was another solution, renting warmth. Enter, the warming pan man. This gentleman, often an older man or a teenage boy trying to scrape together a few coins, would go door to door in winter evenings offering to warm your bed for a small fee. He'd have a satchel of bricks, a bundle of cloth, and maybe, if you were lucky, an actual brass pan. You'd hand him a few pennies, he'd warm up the bricks by your hearth, then trot up to your freezing attic and give your bed a quick swirl. He might also bring gossip, news, or neighborhood rumors, delivered along with the heat. It was the Victorian version of Uber comfort. Mainstream fact? Victorian London saw a small industry built around personal warming services, fire lighting maids, hot water carriers, and yes, bed warmers for hire. Not quite a side hustle, not quite a career, just enough to not freeze. Quirky tidbit? Some warming pan men tied bells to their handles and jingled them as they walked the streets. The sound was meant to be comforting, but more than one cranky pensioner probably chucked a shoe out the window when they jingled too late at night. Historians still argue whether the warming pan trade helped build community ties, or was simply another exploitative labor niche in a rapidly industrializing society. After all, those bells didn't jingle for free. Meanwhile, over in the well-to-do neighborhoods, things looked different. If you were rich, or at least respectably middle class, you had a servant do your bed warming. No clanking up and down the stairs yourself. No blistered hands. The help took care of that. Some of these servants even developed a signature warming swirl, a perfect figure-8 motion under the duvet, quick and even, no scorch marks. It was, bizarrely, a point of pride. There are diary entries from footmen and housemaids noting things like, "Miss Eliza praised my pan work again. Said the sheets were like toast." Victorian Yelp, basically. but let's not pretend it was glamorous work. The job was dangerous, low-paid, and sometimes humiliating. A servant might be blamed for a bad night's sleep, a rumpled sheet, or, heaven forbid, a bed that was warm on only one side. The horror. Even among servants, there was a pecking order. The youngest usually got the warming job, especially in winter, because it meant running up and down stone staircases barefoot, carrying metal, and navigating sleeping children and judgmental cats in the dark. And yet, despite the risks, the injuries, and the occasional smoke-scented pillowcase, bed warming persisted. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about ritual. About showing care. About doing something small and warm in a world that was often very, very cold. Even now, you might imagine that rented warmth. Imagine hearing that soft jingle outside your window, knowing someone's bringing a bit of fire just for you. The door opens. The bricks are still steaming slightly. Your bed is transformed from a slab of ice into a cozy cocoon. Just like that, the class lines of heat are drawn, rented, earned, inherited, or simply made with whatever you had lying around. And in that tiny moment, Victorian society wrapped itself in flannel and tried, just for a while, to feel human. You're lying there now, blankets tucked, warmth settling in, but don't drift off just yet. Because now we're heading down the hallway, quietly, slippers scuffing against the wooden floorboards, to peek into a most curious room, the Victorian bedroom. Specifically, yours. Let's be honest, you'd probably hate it. Victorian bedrooms were, in the most literal sense, cold. Not just temperature-wise, but emotionally. The decor? Heavy. The air? Stale. The walls? Often dark, wallpapered in gloomy florals or oppressive damasks that looked like they were actively trying to muffle joy. The windows were drafty and single-paned, and unless you were in a grand country home with servants galore, chances are your heating came from a single coal fire, if you could afford it. And if not, well, you were back to bricks, bottles, and borrowed embers. Still, that didn't stop Victorians from thinking about warmth constantly. They may not have had insulation, but they had layers. So many layers. The bed itself was a fortress. Feather mattress, wool-stuffed mattress topper, flannel sheets, thick quilts, eiderdown blankets, and possibly a bedspread heavy enough to pin you to the earth like a lead apron at the dentist. If sleep paralysis had a brand sponsor, it would have been the 1870s British blanket industry. And in the middle of all this? The warming pan. Slid beneath those 47 layers of bedding like a knight sneaking into a velvet-draped castle. Mainstream fact? By the mid-19th century, the average well-to-do English home was expected to have separate bedrooms for husband and wife. The belief was that separate sleeping arrangements promoted health, hygiene, and, let's be honest, kept snoring from becoming grounds for divorce. Quirky tidbit? Some couples, despite having their own bedrooms, still insisted their bed warmers be matched, same design, same engraving, same coal. Emotional intimacy through temperature symmetry, as no one said, but probably thought. Historians still argue whether Victorian bedrooms were primarily functional spaces or moral theaters, designed less for sleep and more for demonstrating self-control, virtue, and the right kind of respectability. Were you sleeping, or performing? And let's not forget the accessories. Nightcaps, not the fun kind, bed curtains, to hold in warmth and suppress scandal, and chamber pots, because walking down a dark hallway with a candle and full bladder was a gamble even seasoned Victorians didn't take lightly. Some homes featured warming cupboards built directly into the wall, especially in manors or hospitals. You could slide your bedding in during the day and pull it out toasty at bedtime. The catch? You had to remember to do it hours in advance, or risk climbing into a lukewarm disappointment, possibly still scented faintly of boiled cabbage, depending on the cook's proximity. Speaking of smells, Victorians had a complicated relationship with them. On one hand, they believed bad smells caused disease, hello again, miasma. On the other, their bedding rarely saw a washing machine. A mattress might go years without cleaning. You might sprinkle rosewater or lavender on your pillow, but the real strategy was ignore and hope for the best. Some households solved this by airing their beds every morning with military precision, flinging windows wide open, even in snow, and propping up mattresses like sails to let them breathe. Which, admittedly, is more effort than most of us put into breathing ourselves these days. And yet, in all this chilly austerity, there was something tender about how Victorians treated their sleep. They knew it was precious. They wrote about it. They ritualized it. Entire etiquette guides included instructions on how to conduct yourself before bed, as if you were auditioning for a sleep-themed opera. Your warming pan, then, wasn't just a utility, it was a closing act. The final gesture before surrendering to dreams. You'd watch the steam rise faintly from its seams. You'd hear the coal shift and settle. And you'd know, the bed is ready. The night can begin. Even if the mattress smelled faintly of soot and moral superiority. Now that you're nestled under those metaphorical 50 pounds of Victorian bedding, let's talk about how things sometimes went a little wrong. Because for something designed to bring comfort, the humble bed warmer caused more than its fair share of household chaos. First, let's address the obvious, the fire risk. You're placing a literal metal pan of red-hot embers under something made of cotton, wool, or straw. That's not so much gentle bedtime routine as slow-motion arson with floral curtains. Mainstream fact? Victorian homes were extremely flammable. Open flames from lamps, candles, hearths, and yes, bed warmers contributed to a steady drumbeat of small domestic fires. Insurance companies in the 1800s even had special clauses about fire damage caused by improperly used warming pans. Quirky tidbit? One enterprising pamphlet writer in 1842 proposed a safety bed warming system using heated soapstones instead of coals. He claimed his invention reduced the risk of blanket smoldering and incendiary mishap, though contemporary reviews said the stones smelled oddly of mutton. You win some, you lose some. But it wasn't just flames. Oh no. Victorian bed warmers brought with them a delightful bouquet of less catastrophic but deeply annoying mishaps. The pan might leak ash. It might singe the sheets. It could go clunk in the night if not wedged properly, startling both you and the cat into cardiac distress. If you were particularly unlucky, you might roll over onto a patch that hadn't cooled down yet. Surprise, second-degree thigh burn. Historians still argue whether these hazards contributed to the warming pan's eventual decline, or if it was simply fashion and advancing technology that rendered it obsolete. After all, nothing says I'm over it quite like the invention of the hot water bottle. But don't worry, we'll get to that feud later. Back to the slapstick. Let's say you've got a well-meaning maid tasked with warming your bed. She's young, new, and a little overenthusiastic. She overheats the pan, forgets to shake out the ash, and tucks it just a little too deep under the covers. You climb in. There's a smell. Not the nice lavender sachet smell. More, scorched duck feather. You yank back the blanket. A plume of smoke spirals into the air like a bat signal for your insurance agent. And then there's the curious social tension around bed warming. In some homes, warming pans were considered a bit too old-fashioned, a throwback to country grandmothers and fussy servants. In others, they were a cherished ritual. Disagreeing over their use could become a low-stakes domestic war. There's a recorded anecdote from 1877 of a young wife who insisted on using a warming pan in her London home, while her husband, fresh from university and bursting with modern ideas, declared it an embarrassment to progress. They compromised by using it only on Thursdays, which probably tells you everything about Victorian marriage dynamics. And of course, no discussion of warming pan disasters would be complete without the Great Goose Feather incident of 1861. According to one diary entry, a family in Yorkshire attempted to combine two comfort strategies, the bed warmer and the down mattress. Unfortunately, a stray coal sparked a chain reaction. The mattress ignited internally, the feathers burst out, and the resulting smoke and fluff were so dense that neighbors assumed the house had exploded. No one was harmed, except the family's pride and their poor mattress, which was buried with full honors. These stories might sound absurd to us now, wrapped in our microwavable rice bags and Bluetooth-controlled heating pads, but they reflect something deeply human, the endless struggle to stay warm without getting singed. It's the line we all walk, sometimes literally, with a hot pan and cold feet. And yet, despite all the risk, the warming pan persisted. Because in a world of soot, fog, and frostbitten chamber pots, a warm bed felt like a small miracle. Worth a few singed corners. Worth a goose feather explosion or two. So tonight, as your own sheets settle into that perfect body temperature equilibrium, think of those early sleepers tiptoeing around embers, praying their mattress wouldn't go up in smoke. They risked a lot for a little comfort, and they'd probably laugh to see how seriously we take our weighted blankets. You survived the soot, dodged the singe, and tucked yourself in just so. Now let's look at how the humble bed warmer became, rather unexpectedly, a status symbol. Yes, really. Because in the Victorian world, where every object whispered something about your class, taste, and marital prospects, even a chunk of hot metal was never just a chunk of hot metal. Mainstream fact? By the mid-1800s, wealthier households had upgraded from basic brass or copper pans to elaborately decorated warming devices. Some had hand-chased floral patterns, family crests etched on the lid, or even tiny porcelain inlays. This wasn't just about heating your bed, it was about saying, "Look how elegantly I roast my feet at night." Quirky tidbit? A few eccentric aristocrats commissioned personalized bed warmers with poetic inscriptions, like "Sleep, thou gentle thief of time" or "Scorch not the dowry." One infamous example from a Bath estate had the Latin phrase "calor, non ardor," heat, not passion, engraved around its rim. A little reminder, perhaps, that warm sheets were welcome, but scandal was not. Historians still argue whether these decorative flourishes were purely aesthetic, or part of a deeper effort by the Victorian elite to separate themselves from their sweatier, sootier forebears. Was it hygiene? Taste? Or just a desperate need to show off in every conceivable room of the house? Even the act of warming a bed had its class markers. For the upper crust, a servant, often the maid, would perform the task before bedtime, slipping into the room with practiced grace, gliding the pan back and forth under the covers in long, even strokes. The goal was not only to warm the bed evenly but to do so without rumpling the expensive bedding. In contrast, middle-class families often did it themselves, sometimes squabbling over who'd fetched the coals last, or whether someone had forgotten and left the pan sitting on the landing, still warm, but slightly menacing. If you were poor, of course, none of this applied. You probably didn't have a metal pan at all. Maybe a brick wrapped in a rag, or a bottle tucked into your armpit, or just the residual warmth of whoever slept there last. Status didn't trickle down quite as evenly as soot. Still, even among the working class, there was pride in the bed-warming routine. Some families passed down makeshift warmers like heirlooms, old kettles with dented lids, or chipped ceramic pots that had seen 3 generations of winters. And then there were the social messages encoded in who received a warmed bed. In servant-run households, the head of the house, usually the man, had his bed warmed without fail. Children and guests came next. A well-run home could be measured by the order and precision of its nightly warming schedule. Heaven help the servant who confused the guest room with the daughters, or left the visiting bishop with cold toes. In some romantic households, a freshly warmed bed was considered an act of affection. Picture it, a young wife sneaking upstairs early to warm the covers for her husband, or vice versa. It might be the most physically intimate gesture either had made that week, outside of awkward hand-holding during Sunday service. But there was also a strange edge to it. Because warmth could become currency. Some families withheld bed warming as a kind of punishment. You forgot to bring in coal today? Enjoy the icy sheets. Passive aggression, Victorian style, less slamming doors, more frostbitten toes. Over time, gift catalogs began to include ornamental bed warmers among their listings. One 1891 London Christmas brochure featured a gentleman's engraved pan complete with a telescoping handle, marketed as a thoughtful gift for fathers, uncles, or moderately appreciated in-laws. And if you really wanted to make a splash? There were electric warmers by the turn of the 20th century. Hugely expensive, mildly dangerous, and terribly unreliable, but very modern. Like buying a smart fridge today that sends passive-aggressive texts when you're out of oat milk. By then, the warming pan had gone from necessity to novelty, from tool to token. But in the golden age of the Victorian home, it was still serious business. There was warmth, yes, but also rank, ritual, and a certain gleaming polish that said, "We are civilized people. We may freeze during carriage rides, but by God, our beds are cozy." So next time you warm your bed with a button, a bean bag, or just your own body heat, spare a moment for those who came before, those who wielded their bed warmers like little brass scepters of domestic order. You're not just getting warm. You're getting respectably warm. By now, you're quite the connoisseur of warm beds and cold social cues, but what happens when things heat up in the political sense? Yes, even something as cozy-sounding as a bed warmer managed to tiptoe into the realm of gender politics in Victorian England. You see, bed warming wasn't just about comfort, it was about who had the right to comfort, and who was expected to make it happen. Mainstream fact? In most Victorian households, the act of warming the bed fell squarely on the shoulders of female servants, often the lowest-ranked maids, like the scullery maid or under-housemaid. Despite being physically exhausting and sometimes dangerous, the job was considered simple, domestic, and thus, naturally, feminine. And here's your quirky tidbit. A satirical cartoon from 1872 shows a maid dragging a too-hot bed warmer down the hallway, leaving a trail of scorched carpet behind her. The caption reads, "Missed the bed, Master James, hope you don't mind the hallway." It's a cheeky jab at the low expectations placed on domestic help and the absurdity of their nightly to-do list. Historians still argue whether bed warming truly reinforced traditional gender roles or if it quietly chipped away at them. After all, the women who warmed the beds also handled fire, carried coal, and sometimes confronted danger directly, hardly the delicate angels the era claimed to idealize. Let's imagine it together. You're a maid, 16 years old, rising before dawn and retiring after everyone else has drifted into slumber. It's winter. You've just spent an hour scrubbing soot from the hearth. Your reward? Hauling a scalding hot metal pan from the kitchen to the bedrooms upstairs, balancing it like some glowing cauldron of doom. One wrong move, and you scorch the bedding. Worse, you scorch yourself. And if you don't do it, if you forget, or simply run out of time, you're likely to be met with a stern talking to about proper nighttime presentation and the expectations of a genteel household. Bed warming, in this light, becomes a quiet little battlefield. A place where women, maids, wives, daughters, were expected to serve not just with competence, but with invisibility. Their efforts were to be felt but not seen. The warm bed was the goal, but the work behind it? Ideally forgotten. There's even evidence that some women began to push back, subtly. A diary entry from a lady's maid in 1868 reads, "I set the pan early, then let it cool somewhat before passing it along." She likes the idea of warmth more than the heat itself. In other words, she knew her mistress cared more about the ritual than the result, and used that to reclaim a bit of sanity in her nightly routine. Among wives, things were more nuanced. In many households, a wife warming the bed was seen as part of her wifely duties, a nurturing, maternal gesture. But not every woman was on board with that. One letter from 1893 describes a woman who insisted on using an automatic warming device because she refused to shuffle about the house like a chambermaid. Her husband, scandalized, wrote to the manufacturer to complain that the gadget was loud, unfeminine, and unsettling to the pets. Ah yes, the eternal struggle, technology versus gender norms. As debates over women's roles began to simmer, especially toward the turn of the century, the bed warmer became an odd little symbol. On one hand, it was a mark of cozy domesticity. On the other, it was one more task laid at the feet of overworked women, often without recognition or appreciation. This tension even found its way into literature. Victorian novels frequently include passing references to the ritual of warming beds, often with a tone of wistful nostalgia or subtle sarcasm. One character might comment on how lovely it is to slide into warm sheets, while another mutters about the poor girl who had to drag that thing up 3 flights of stairs. And then there's the growing role of middle-class women using catalogs and home journals to find alternatives. Hot water bottles, warming stones, electric pads, all marketed as modern, elegant, and crucially, less work. These innovations didn't just offer physical comfort, they offered relief from expectation. Because when you remove the pan, you remove the person behind it. So, as you lie there now, gently cocooned and possibly wondering whether your heated mattress pad is a feminist statement, remember, behind every warm Victorian bed was a pair of tired hands. Hands that lit the fire, shook the ash, carried the weight. Hands that sometimes fought quietly for a little rest of their own. Tonight, we salute them. By this point in your journey through soot, status, and simmering gender roles, you might be wondering, what about the actual science? Surely not every Victorian was content to simply toss a blazing metal pan under their linens and hope for the best. Indeed, there was some logic to all of it. Welcome to the warm, slow-burning world of Victorian heating methods. Mainstream fact? In the absence of central heating, the average Victorian bedroom hovered between 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, 41 to 50 Fahrenheit, in winter. With no insulation to speak of and single-pane windows that rattled in the wind, climbing into bed without a warming device was like voluntarily hugging a snowman. So, to survive the freeze, people got creative. Enter the brick wrapped in flannel, the soapstone block simmered beside the hearth, or, if you were especially crafty, the tin pig, a long, low metal box with rounded edges and a hinged lid, filled with embers and placed at the foot of the bed. It looked a bit like an angry lunchbox, but it got the job done. Quirky tidbit? In northern Scotland, a few households swore by warmed sacks of dried peas. Yes, peas. Once heated near the fire, they were dumped into cloth pouches and tucked under the sheets. The idea was that they retained heat and gave a pleasant, weighty feel. And when the peas cooled, you cooked them for soup. Waste not, want not. Historians still argue whether Victorian people genuinely believed these heating devices were medically beneficial or if it was just a matter of comfort. Plenty of period advice manuals declared that warming the feet before sleep drew blood from the head and settled the spirits, thus preventing nightmares, nosebleeds, or, dramatic pause, insomniac melancholy. Whether or not any of that was true, people certainly felt better. You, for example, have probably noticed your shoulders drop at the mere thought of warm sheets. That's not a placebo, that's physiology. Interestingly, heat wasn't just reserved for beds. Foot warmers were a booming business, especially for coach passengers. These were little portable metal boxes filled with embers, placed beneath a lady's skirts during long, freezing rides. That sounds quaint, until you realize these were also used in churches. Picture it, a solemn Sunday sermon, with rows of polished boots propped near quietly smoldering tins. One woman reportedly lit her foot warmer too early during a service, causing a faint wisp of smoke to curl up from her pew. The resulting confusion led to an impromptu fire drill, and a very red-faced vicar. Even physicians got in on the warmth trend. Medical handbooks of the time recommended warm compresses and heated bricks not only for sleep but also for female complaints, colic, and even melancholy. One 1855 pamphlet recommends holding a hot tile against your stomach while reciting gentle prayers of gratitude. Whether the tile or the gratitude did more of the work, we'll never know. This marriage of science and superstition reached its peak in the late Victorian era, with the invention of the thermal blanket, a quilted contraption lined with thin metal coils that could be heated near the fire and then spread over the bed. It was safer than an ember-filled pan, but required the user to flip it every 30 minutes for even warmth. Which kind of defeats the purpose of a good night's sleep. For children, especially the sickly or nervous, doctors sometimes prescribed bed roasting, which sounds far more traumatic than it was. Essentially, a child would be placed in a well-warmed bed, swaddled in wool, and left to nap with a lightly warmed stone at their feet. This, they believed, would soothe the nerves and restore youthful vigor. Today we call that a weighted blanket and a nap, but who's counting? And, of course, there were mishaps. In 1879, a medical journal described the case of a man who suffered mild scalding of the posterior after confusing a pan meant for the bed with one used for boiling rags in the scullery. His recovery was swift, though his pride was left permanently wrinkled. All this to say, warmth was both a comfort and a calculated effort. The Victorian bedroom wasn't merely a place of rest, it was a battlefield of heat conservation. Duvets were layered like geological strata, and the successful warming of a bed was as much a triumph of domestic science as it was a matter of luxury. And just think, while you lie there now, perhaps swaddled in fleece, your thermostat set with casual flicks of a phone app, somewhere in your ancestry was a person who rose at midnight to flip a heated stone. Not for glory, not for pay. Just for a chance at an uninterrupted night's sleep. Now that's love. Or at least, perseverance. As we drift further into this cozy, peculiar world of Victorian heating, you might wonder, how long did it take for these old-fashioned, sweat-inducing techniques to give way to something more modern? The short answer is, far too long. But the long answer? Well, that's where things get even more fascinating. Mainstream fact? By the early 20th century, technology started creeping into the home in unexpected ways. Central heating was still decades away, but devices like the electric bed warmer and, later, electric blankets began making their debut. Yet, despite the promise of modern convenience, it was only the upper middle and wealthy classes who truly benefited from these advances. The first electric bed warmer, in 1898, was bulky and unreliable, akin to a small refrigerator perched on the bed frame. Its whisper-quiet motor hummed like a distant lawnmower, and it came with a reassuring warning, do not fall asleep while plugged in. Practical, right? Quirky tidbit? Some middle-class families, ever the resourceful ones, used to make their own electric warmers by rigging up old-fashioned fans and electric blankets to battery-powered radios. These DIY contraptions might have looked a bit like science experiments gone wrong, but for many, they provided a semblance of progress, even if the risk of electrocution was a tad higher than advertised. Historians still argue whether the mass production of electric warming devices marked the death of the bed warmer as a status symbol or whether it simply evolved into the world of electrical appliances and thermostats. You see, these new gadgets didn't require a servant to operate, but they did promise a level of sophistication and modernity that carried its own brand of elegance. Meanwhile, in the hearts of Victorian homes, there was still an unwavering devotion to tradition. In rural areas, where electricity hadn't quite arrived, families clung to their trusty bed warming techniques. Old-fashioned warming pans, filled with glowing coals or bricks, continued to rule the roost well into the 1920s. Many older folk, particularly grandmothers, swore that there was something uniquely proper about a well-warmed bed. Newfangled contraptions, they argued, were nothing more than a shortcut for the lazy. Even as the world around them changed, automobiles, radios, even early televisions, Victorian bed-warming rituals remained steeped in a nostalgic comfort, like wearing a favorite pair of slippers you've had since childhood. It wasn't about progress, it was about preserving a piece of the past, a simpler time, perhaps, where warmth was something that had to be earned. And then, there were those that rejected all the frills, opting for a much simpler solution, heating pads and hot water bottles. These nifty inventions became immensely popular, providing a simpler alternative to warming the entire bed. But even then, they weren't without controversy. If you were caught just using a water bottle, your fellow Victorians might raise an eyebrow, as it was seen as improper to avoid the full ritual. Some accounts show people deliberately letting their bottles cool before slipping into bed so they didn't look like they were slacking off. Picture it, a woman waking from a nap, remembering that she hadn't preheated her sheets, hastily placing a warm water bottle under her covers with a sigh of relief, but also slight embarrassment. By the mid-20th century, with the advent of modern insulation and centralized heating, the bed warmer would slip into obscurity, much like the lavish fire screens and heavy curtains of the previous century. The space once filled with metal pans, hot bricks, and electric coils was now a place of comfort, yes, but of quiet comfort. The heat was there, but without ceremony, no rituals, no servants. The warmth, it seems, had lost its prestige. Interestingly, as the 21st century dawned, some vintage enthusiasts began rediscovering these older methods, just as people today yearn for the slow, tactile comfort of handmade blankets, vintage teapots, or old cookbooks. There was a certain nostalgia, perhaps for an era when we had to work a little harder to achieve something we take for granted now. So now, when you climb into your well-heated bed, tucked in under blankets with the convenience of a digital thermostat at your fingertips, you might be sharing something more profound with the Victorians than just the sensation of warmth. You're sharing the memory of effort, of intention, and perhaps even of an era when a good night's sleep was something you had to earn, through hot pans, stoked fires, and the quiet hum of heat, inching its way under the covers. And while we've traded in the old methods, there's still something deeply comforting about this little piece of history. After all, when was the last time your blanket came with a story? By now, you're probably starting to understand that the bed warmer was much more than just a tool, it was a cultural icon. But, let's take a step back and examine the real heart of the matter. Was the bed warmer a symbol of class, or a commentary on Victorian life itself? Mainstream fact? In the Victorian era, the class divide was sharply defined, and the very rituals of bedtime were no exception. For the wealthy, a warm bed was the epitome of luxury, a symbol of comfort and privilege. For the working class, it was often a matter of necessity, not indulgence. But regardless of class, the bed warmer was universally accepted as a mark of civility. Quirky tidbit? Some wealthy Victorians would even go as far as hiring specialists for their bed warming needs. Bed warmers, believe it or not, could be trained just like domestic servants. These professionals, known as bed warming specialists, were often highly valued and paid well, as they were responsible for ensuring the bed was perfectly preheated, with the right amount of heat, at the right time. Imagine that, a career based entirely on warming up sheets. It was the height of domestic artistry. Historians still argue whether these class distinctions around warming beds played into the larger social construct of how Victorian society viewed labor. The working class, often relegated to the toughest, most unpleasant tasks, was expected to do all of this physically demanding work, while the wealthy could luxuriate in the fruits of others' labor. But was there a price to this luxury? Many of these domestic servants, particularly those who worked in aristocratic homes, found themselves facing difficult conditions. They were expected to be invisible, to perform their tasks without ever drawing attention to themselves, and to ensure that the household ran smoothly without complaint. The servants' beds, if they even had one, were often in unheated, cold attics, far from the warmth they so meticulously prepared for their masters. Here's an interesting point: servants, particularly the younger maids, would often be tasked with making sure the beds of the masters were perfectly prepared before the family went to bed. These workers were expected to operate in a kind of domestic choreography. Crawling into a warm bed themselves was simply not on the agenda. The beauty of it all? The bed they warmed might be colder than their own, but they still made sure it was a place of warmth for others. The term bed warmers even made its way into popular parlance. In literature, the image of a servant warming the bed became a symbol for self-sacrifice and servitude. Dickens himself uses this imagery in some of his works, particularly in descriptions of characters like Pip from Great Expectations, who both longed for and resented the comforts of wealth. It's clear that the bed warmer, no matter how essential it was to the process of domestic comfort, came with its own set of moral and social implications. Quirky tidbit: some mid-19th century Victorian novels romanticized the bed warmer in a highly unexpected way. In one, a protagonist, upon returning home from a long trip, finds that the only thing that will make him feel at peace is the warm bed waiting for him, expertly prepared by a devoted servant. There's a soft poignancy in these moments, comfort not just in the warmth, but in the unspoken understanding between employer and servant. These emotional undertones made their way into the collective psyche of the time, reinforcing the idea that physical warmth could also provide emotional solace. Historians still debate whether these literary depictions romanticized the plight of the servant or whether they spoke to a deeper, more personal connection between the classes. The bed warmer as a tool, as a metaphor, and as a bridge between classes was undoubtedly multi-layered. It was both a product of and a commentary on Victorian social structures, a paradoxical fusion of luxury and labor. As these social dynamics unfolded, it's important to realize that the bed warmer wasn't a fixed entity, it evolved. As we moved into the 20th century, there was a shift away from the human element in heating beds. Electric blankets, with their quiet hum of modernity, began to replace the more traditional methods. The ritual of having a servant warm your bed became, in some ways, a relic of a bygone era. But here's the fascinating thing, even with the advent of technological solutions, the need for comfort, the desire for warmth, both physical and emotional, remained. The way people sought out comfort was fundamentally the same, it was just the means of obtaining it that changed. The journey from a servant's weary hands to an electric blanket was not a loss of warmth but a transformation of how we engaged with it. And now, as you relax in your own bed, possibly with your own electric heating pad warming your feet, consider this: when you slide between the sheets, you're not just entering into a private moment of rest. You're also participating in a deeply historical tradition, one that stretches back centuries. Whether you're enjoying the warmth of a modern heating pad or perhaps a gentle blanket from an old quilt, you're connected, however indirectly, to those early Victorians and their literal and figurative quests for warmth. A simple act, really, but as history goes, it's a deeply symbolic one. As we continue to gently unravel the layers of Victorian bedwarming rituals, it's essential to take a step back and explore the grander context. What role did these practices play within the grand narrative of the Victorian home, and how did they reflect the societal expectations of the time? Mainstream fact? The Victorian era, stretching from 1837 to 1901, was not just an age of industrial growth and scientific discovery, but also one of intense domesticity. A home wasn't just a place to live, it was a showcase of one's status, family values, and, above all else, moral standing. Your home, from the furniture to the furnace, spoke volumes about you. And nowhere was this more evident than in the bedroom. The concept of the bedroom itself had undergone a dramatic transformation during the Victorian period. No longer merely a place for rest, the bedroom was now a sanctuary, a reflection of an individual's social, emotional, and even spiritual well-being. While today we think of our bedrooms as personal spaces, during the Victorian era, they were carefully curated to reflect one's position in society. This often meant a well-made, properly prepped bed that communicated a certain level of sophistication. Quirky tidbit? In some middle-class households, the bed was viewed as a kind of public symbol. It wasn't unusual for Victorian families to invite guests into their homes and proudly display their lavishly decorated beds. You'd have to carefully ensure that the sheets were pristine, the blankets were properly arranged, and, naturally, the bed warmer was at the ready to ensure optimal warmth. There were even instances where people held bedroom tours for family and friends. Don't worry, no one had to sleep in it, but it was important to be seen. A neat, well-warmed bed was considered a social and moral triumph. Historians still argue whether this obsession with a perfect home and idealized bedrooms spoke more to the Victorians' deep anxiety about appearances than any real interest in comfort. If your bed wasn't perfectly prepared, heated to the right temperature, with every fold aligned, then what did that say about your moral fiber? Was it a question of housekeeping, or a measure of your personal virtue? The bed warmer's role in all this was symbolic in more ways than one. After all, the process of warming a bed wasn't a quick, superficial task. It was an act of care, of dedication. Warming the bed, carefully placing a pan or stone beneath the linens, was an intimate gesture of hospitality. But, just as we saw with servants' roles, it wasn't always about generosity, it was also about maintaining appearance. Take, for instance, the rituals surrounding the well-off Victorian family's bedtime. For the upper class, the preparation of the bedroom was an event, a small, quiet performance, where nothing was left to chance. The positioning of the bed warmer was scrutinized. Was it too close to the feet? Too far from the head? And could it possibly be too warm? Was that just excessive? The proper level of warmth was as critical as the cleanliness of the linens or the delicacy of the lace curtains. Quirky tidbit? In fact, there were entire etiquette books dedicated to the art of preparing a perfect Victorian bed. Yes, entire manuals were written on how to fold the sheets, layer the blankets, and even the angle at which the bed warmer should be placed to ensure a good night's sleep. These books were marketed as guides to domestic perfection, promising to help readers unlock the secrets to an idyllic, harmonious home life. Imagine that, the pursuit of the ideal bed as the pathway to moral and social success. Historians still debate whether these elaborate rituals surrounding the bed were driven by genuine comfort or if they were merely a form of social competition. You see, in the world of Victorian upper-class society, it wasn't just about having a warm bed, it was about who could create the warmest, most comfortable environment. Those who could afford to hire multiple servants to do the work were seen as having achieved the pinnacle of domestic success. And yet, despite all the focus on the domestic aesthetic, there was a growing awareness of how these practices could impact one's health. As beds were warmed and linen sheets pressed against the body, there were rising concerns about the effects of prolonged heat exposure. While some believed it encouraged a restful sleep, others were beginning to question whether it was healthy to indulge in such extreme comforts. By the late Victorian era, there were whispers about overheating, the idea that being too comfortable in bed might lead to more serious health issues like feverish dreams or the dreaded sleep sweats. Indeed, some critics of Victorian domesticity claimed that too much heat, especially from metal bed warmers or hot bricks, could stifle the vital organs, causing long-term damage. This concern eventually led to a more widespread belief in the dangers of overindulgence in comfort. However, it didn't stop most people from insisting on the need for heat. The quest for perfect comfort was too deeply ingrained in the fabric of Victorian life. As the 20th century arrived, many of these debates began to fade into the background, replaced by new priorities, such as efficiency and speed. The old rituals of bed warming were slowly phased out in favor of electric blankets and heaters, devices that were far more convenient, though certainly lacking in the personal touch that the Victorian approach had afforded. Nevertheless, what's fascinating is that, much like the reverence we now show for vintage furniture or antique cooking methods, there's been a quiet resurgence in interest around these old practices. There's something almost nostalgic about the thought of hand-warming your bed, about taking the time to ensure a level of comfort that goes beyond mere functionality. And while we may have traded the warming pans for electrical outlets, the underlying human desire for comfort, care, and feeling at home remains as strong as ever. So, next time you settle into your modern, climate-controlled bed, know that you're linked by more than just time. You're connected to the same need for warmth that has been woven into the very fabric of humanity for centuries. As you shift slightly under the covers, perhaps adjusting your pillow or stretching your toes just a bit deeper into the warmth, let's drift into another facet of this quietly fascinating tale. Tonight, we look at the curious intersection between bed warmers and early Victorian medicine. Because yes, even the humble act of warming a bed had medical implications, or so they believed. Mainstream fact? Victorian medicine was a blend of emerging science and long-held superstition. While doctors were beginning to understand germ theory and the basics of hygiene, much of what passed as medical advice was still rooted in the four humors, miasma theory, and an abiding fear of night air. According to many 19th-century physicians, nighttime was when the body was at its most vulnerable, when illness could creep in silently through a cold draft or damp bedsheets. Enter the bed warmer. Doctors of the era often prescribed warmed beds as a remedy for everything from colds to melancholia. A warm bed wasn't just a comfort, it was a preventive measure. A cold bed, on the other hand, was seen as a direct invitation to pneumonia, consumption, or worse, the chills, a vague but ominous diagnosis that seemed to float between genuine illness and moral failing. Quirky tidbit? In one 1853 pamphlet on proper sleep habits for the urban gentleman, the author recommends not only warming the bed but also applying a heated stone to the lower back 30 minutes prior to sleep to stimulate internal humors. There's something wonderfully surreal about the image, a prim Victorian man, perched on the edge of a feather mattress, waiting for his lumbar to become properly humored. Historians still argue whether these medical recommendations were based on any genuine physiological effect or if they simply reflected the era's obsession with ritual and routine. After all, the Victorian medical world was one where leeches were still in use, and opium was considered a perfectly reasonable bedtime remedy. In that context, heated stones seemed downright wholesome. There were also specific prescriptions for women, naturally. A lady's constitution was viewed as delicate, and her health easily upset by chill or damp. Physicians often warned of the dangers of stepping into a cold bed, particularly for women who were pregnant, menstruating, or simply of nervous temperament, which, in Victorian language, was code for almost anything. The bed warmer thus became a quiet hero of women's health, or, at least, a recurring character in doctors' recommendations. One popular theory held that warming the bed could prevent what was called hysteria, a diagnosis applied almost exclusively to women and blamed for everything from anxiety to indigestion. According to some practitioners, a warm bed helped settle the female nerves, allowing for more restful sleep and better moods. Of course, this theory has since been debunked as little more than medicalized sexism, but it's remarkable how often these everyday items found themselves swept up in the cultural understanding of health and gender. Quirky tidbit? There's a surviving record of a 19th-century women's sanitarium that used warmed beds as part of their evening ritual. Patients were tucked in with flannel blankets, their beds pre-warmed with ceramic foot warmers filled with hot sand. Staff referred to it as the nightly recalibration, which sounds more like a steampunk spa treatment than medical therapy. The Victorians also believed that certain materials used in bed warmers had specific health properties. Tin was said to provide a more even heat that soothed the spleen. Brass was considered beneficial for circulation. And earthenware, if you were lucky enough to own a glazed warming jug, was believed to draw out negative humors from the lower extremities. Again, there's no scientific evidence for any of this, but it speaks volumes about how seriously the Victorians took their bedtime rituals. Historians still debate the actual health impact of all this warming. Some suggest that it reduced the likelihood of hypothermia and improved sleep quality, especially in drafty or damp homes. Others argue that it made little difference, and that any improvements in health were likely due to better hygiene, diet, or just the natural course of recovery. What's certain, though, is that the emotional comfort of a warm bed probably did as much good as any poultice or tonic. And that emotional comfort can't be overstated. You can picture it, a person slipping into a bed that's been thoughtfully warmed, the outside chill kept at bay, and the soft scent of flannel mingling with a faint whisper of coal smoke or lavender water. In an age when illness could strike with little warning and medicine offered few guarantees, such small rituals must have provided tremendous reassurance. It's worth noting that while the upper and middle classes could afford such luxuries, the working poor had fewer options. Cold, damp tenements, shared beds, and thin blankets were common in the urban centers of Victorian England. For these individuals, a bed warmer wasn't just a comfort, it was often a necessity. Many used improvised warmers, metal pots, hot bricks, even heated potatoes wrapped in rags. Practical, yes. Elegant, no. But then again, comfort doesn't always look refined. And so, the medical logic behind bed warmers, flawed or not, reminds us of something essential: the need to feel safe, to be soothed, and to trust that tomorrow might start just a little better if tonight ends in warmth. Whether the remedy was real or imagined mattered less than the ritual itself. So go ahead. Imagine yourself in that darkened Victorian room, the hearth fading to embers, a faint creak in the floorboards as someone gently lifts a brass warmer from your sheets. The mattress welcomes you like a promise. The world, just for this moment, is a little less cold now that you're tucked into the quiet rhythms of this strange and toasty tale. Let's glide gently into a lighter but no less curious corner of Victorian life, the rise of satire and public commentary on bed warmers. Because while doctors were prescribing them and households were treasuring them, the wits of the era, they were having a field day. Mainstream fact? The Victorian period was a golden age for satire. Publications like Punch magazine, launched in 1841, thrived on poking fun at everything from politics to social habits, and domestic oddities were ripe for skewering. The bed warmer, despite its innocent role, became an easy metaphor for Victorian excess, prudery, and obsession with etiquette. Writers and illustrators alike seemed enchanted by the comic potential of bed warmers. Their phallic shape, their sometimes scorched results, and the general overthinking of how best to use them all lent themselves beautifully to double entendres and visual gags. You can almost hear the mustached illustrator chuckling into his tea as he sketches a portly man slipping on a spilled warming pan. Quirky tidbit? One popular cartoon from the 1870s depicts a newlywed couple in bed, surrounded by no fewer than 6 bed warmers, each labeled with a different instruction like 4 feet, for kidneys, for melancholy, and for Aunt Gertrude's complaints. The husband, sweating profusely, is shown whispering, "Darling, I think we're being overly preventative." The wife responds cheerfully, "Nonsense, dear. This is medically balanced bedding." Historians still argue whether the surge in bedwarmer satire reflected genuine public skepticism about these rituals or was simply a convenient vessel for broader social commentary. In an age of repression and rigid manners, poking fun at the peculiarities of nighttime habits gave people a safe, domestic outlet for deeper anxieties, about gender roles, about class, even about the body. It wasn't just magazines. Playwrights got in on the act, too. Light comedies performed in music halls and drawing rooms would often include a scene featuring the dreaded clatter of a metal bed warmer dropped too early, or the uptight mother-in-law insisting the pan be placed precisely under the left foot only or risk spiritual ruin. These sketches, while played for laughs, also underscored the absurdities of overprescribed propriety. Quirky tidbit? There's a little-known Victorian one-act play titled The Last Warm Night, in which a wealthy hypochondriac insists on traveling with her own personal bed-warming valet. The character, a perpetually annoyed servant named Giles, has no lines except for loudly sighing and muttering things like, "Hotter than Hades again, milady." The play ends with the warming pan being mistaken for a teapot and served at a formal breakfast. Riveting stuff. And let's not forget the poets. Yes, even poets found a way to muse on the humble bed warmer. Take this excerpt from an 1865 comic poem. "O blessed pan of scald and flame, you've scorched my dreams and signed your name upon my thigh, in blister red. Yet still, I dare not leave my bed." Not exactly Byron, but you get the idea. The popularity of this kind of writing tells us something important. Even in an age obsessed with refinement, people loved to laugh at themselves, and at the bizarre measures they went to for a good night's sleep. But humor, of course, walks hand in hand with anxiety. Some commentators used bed warmers as a symbol of the broader fear that Victorian society was growing too dependent on comforts, too sensitive to the cold, too fragile. Was the growing use of these devices a sign that people had lost their toughness? Had the empire built on steam and steel gone soft under lace blankets and glowing coals? Historians still debate whether these criticisms were merely performative or genuinely represented a cultural shift. There's a fine line between mocking the elite's bedwarmer obsession and quietly envying the luxury of warm sheets. For many working-class readers of Punch, the satire was a kind of release, a way to chuckle at the excesses of those better off, while dreaming of such comforts themselves. It's also worth noting that some satirical treatments turned toward the metaphysical. One essay from the 1880s mused, entirely tongue-in-cheek, that bed warmers were a moral hazard. A gateway to spiritual laziness, tempting the soul into a state of sloth by removing the bracing discomfort of a cold mattress. In other words, true virtue was forged not in warmth, but in frosty suffering. Quirky tidbit? A temperance pamphlet once compared the use of bed warmers to the soft sin of brandy by the fire, a comforting indulgence that dulled moral judgment. One wonders what these people would have made of central heating. Still, even as bed warmers became fodder for endless jokes, they never truly fell out of favor. If anything, the jokes were part of the charm. To mock the warming pan was, in its own way, to love it. Like teasing a friend for always needing an extra blanket, an affection cloaked in irony. So, the next time you see an antique bed warmer in a museum or dusty corner shop, don't just think of it as a tool. Think of it as a stage prop. Imagine all the people who tripped over it, scorched themselves with it, or wrote snide poems in its honor. It's more than metal, it's a piece of social theater. And maybe, just maybe, imagine yourself as the unwitting guest at a Victorian dinner party, offered a bed for the night, only to discover your host has left behind an ominous brass pan. Do you touch it? Do you move it? Or do you, as one witty writer put it, accept the slow burn of hospitality? Your eyes are heavy now, but let's take a gentle stroll into the winding paths of the Victorian economy, specifically, the quiet little industry that bloomed from the modest bed warmer. Because, believe it or not, warming beds wasn't just a domestic habit. It was a business. A surprisingly cozy one. Mainstream fact? The Victorian period saw the rise of the domestic goods industry in ways England, and much of the Western world, had never seen before. The Industrial Revolution had paved the way for mass production, and the expanding middle class was eager to outfit their homes with the latest comforts. Bed warmers, once handcrafted by village blacksmiths or tinkers, became commercial products advertised in shop windows, catalogs, and yes, even door-to-door. By the 1850s, manufacturers in Birmingham, Sheffield, and beyond were producing warming pans, foot warmers, and ceramic bed bottles in high volumes. They came in brass, copper, tin, and porcelain. Some were plain and purely functional. Others were engraved with swirling Victorian flourishes, floral motifs, or embossed with family crests, as if the nobility required their toes to be warmed in heraldic style. Quirky tidbit? One 1862 London catalogue offered a wedding dowry set that included a monogrammed bed warmer, 2 hand-painted stoneware foot jugs, and a small pamphlet titled The Art of Thermal Matrimony. You really can't make this stuff up. Historians still argue whether these items were genuinely status symbols or simply marketed that way to coax anxious new consumers into buying things they never knew they needed. In truth, it was probably both. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances, and having a polished brass bed warmer hanging by your fireplace sent a quiet signal that your home was not only respectable, it was warmly respectable. Retailers leaned into this hard. Advertisements used language like "for the refined lady's boudoir" or "a worthy addition to the modern gentleman's slumber." Some even claimed that their particular warming device offered superior health benefits, with patent-pending technologies like heat retention ribs and fumeless venting chambers. Spoiler, those didn't actually do much. But they sounded important. Bed warmer sales boomed during the colder months, of course, but clever sellers found ways to extend their usefulness. Summer ads suggested using the pans to warm laundry, heat bathing towels, or even assist elderly pets in their nap routines. Yes, there's a delightful ad showing a small terrier curled up next to a glowing jug labeled "Snug Pup Approved." Quirky tidbit? In 1879, one ambitious merchant in Manchester opened a warming emporium that claimed to sell nothing but heating accessories. Among the offerings? A double-handled warming pan for couples, a travel version that collapsed into a satchel, and a miniature set for children's beds, because nothing says luxury like a pre-warmed nursery nap. As demand grew, so did the supply chain. Artisans specialized in decorative metalwork for handles, potters crafted ceramic cores that held heat longer, and entire workshops focused on the rubber stoppers and carrying straps. The warming industry quietly employed hundreds, many of whom were women assembling jugs, packing boxes, or polishing brass in near-silent rows. Factories in the Midlands churned out hundreds a week. Historians still debate the true scale of the bedwarmer economy. Some claim it was a passing craze. Others argue it served as a keystone in the development of domestic consumer culture. An early example of how comfort could be commodified, advertised, and packaged into an essential part of middle-class identity. More fascinating still? The emergence of second-hand bedwarmer markets. As wealthier families upgraded to fancier models, older warmers were passed down, resold, or donated. Some were repaired and resold by tinkers who roamed the countryside offering bed comfort renewal services. A few enterprising souls even refurbished discarded warming pans into lamps or footstools. You could argue this was the beginning of both upcycling and eBay, Victorian style. And of course, every boom must invite innovation. By the late 1880s, some companies began experimenting with chemical warming devices, little pouches filled with salt solutions that, when activated, gave off a gentle heat. One such contraption, the Thermodream Pocket, promised flameless nighttime comfort. Unfortunately, it also leaked and had a faint vinegar odor. Sales were short-lived. Quirky tidbit? A notorious 1891 consumer scandal broke out when several warming jugs from a popular London store exploded during use, likely due to overfiring in the kiln. The incident was lampooned as the Great Bed Boom in the press, with one columnist remarking, "It seems the only thing hotter than the warming jug was the customer's temper." Still, these hiccups did little to dampen public appetite. In fact, the controversies likely reinforced how integral these items had become. By the turn of the century, nearly every catalog of domestic goods offered at least 2 pages of warming solutions, from the humble stone bottle to the ornate cast-iron bed beacon deluxe. And what about those who couldn't afford them? Well, some towns had community warming services. A bakery in East Sussex allowed local children to bring bricks to be heated in its ovens during winter evenings. These bricks would then be wrapped in flannel and placed in beds. For a penny, warmth could be borrowed, just for the night. That little piece of shared comfort says more about Victorian values than any monogrammed copper pan ever could. So as you lie here, in your own quiet room, maybe consider how many hands once touched a single warming jug. The potter who shaped it. The shopgirl who polished it. The tinker who repaired it. The tired parent who placed it at the foot of the bed, hoping for one uninterrupted night of peace. It's not just a product, it's a story, a chain of human gestures bound together by warmth. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the soft hiss of water poured into a jug, the slow creak of a bed frame accepting its evening visitor, and the satisfied sigh of someone whose toes have just touched something blissfully warm. And now, let's drift gently into the final flickers of the bed warmer's long, glowing life. Like many cherished comforts of the Victorian age, it didn't end with a bang, but with a slow, steady fade, replaced not by scandal or rejection, but simply by progress. By the early 20th century, the world was heating up, literally and figuratively. Central heating systems were crawling into more homes, starting with the urban elite and gradually seeping into middle-class neighborhoods. The warm water bottle still hung around for a while, especially in drafty country houses and boarding schools, but the grand old warming pan began to look, well, quaint. You can picture it, sitting on a hearth, brass gone dull, handle slightly wobbly, quietly observing its own obsolescence like an elderly butler whose services are no longer required. Mainstream historical fact? The first wave of electric heating pads appeared in the 1910s. By the 1920s, commercial models were available, promising cleaner, safer, and, perhaps most seductive of all, effortless warmth. No more embers. No boiling water. Just a little cord, a twist of a knob, and voila, comfort on demand. Of course, this being the early age of electricity, the promise came with a small risk of electrocution. Or, in some poorly wired models, spontaneous smoking. But even that didn't stop the progress. Compared to the inconvenience of embers or scalding water, electric heat was still a sleepy miracle. Historians still debate whether the decline of the bed warmer represents a loss of domestic intimacy or simply a logical upgrade. Some argue that the rituals around warming beds, boiling the water, tucking in the bottle, checking the stopper, were small acts of love and routine, gone in the flick of a switch. Others say, with a shrug, honestly? People were just tired of setting things on fire before bed. And who could blame them? Quirky tidbit? In 1937, a retired schoolmistress in Bath famously wrote a letter to the Times lamenting the rise of electric warmers, saying she missed the gentle slosh of water bottles and the dear hiss of embers extinguished at midnight. She also claimed that modern warmth lacked soul. An editor responded a week later with a pithy, "Warmth with soul is how fires start, madam." Still, the nostalgia persisted. Antique bed warmers began showing up in second-hand shops, and by the 1950s, they were officially vintage. Some families proudly hung them on their walls like heirlooms, because nothing says family pride like something you used to fill with coals and tuck under your grandmother. As for ceramic warmers and bottles, they had a longer life. Some hospitals continued using them well into the mid-century, particularly in children's wards and maternity clinics. A warm jug beneath the sheets wasn't just comforting. It could help regulate body temperature, particularly in drafty wards with single-pane windows and no modern insulation. But, eventually, even the humble hot water bottle found itself updated, streamlined, and reinvented. Rubber took over from stoneware. Microwavable gel packs muscled their way into pharmacies. And now, here we are, more than 100 years later, with heated mattress pads, smart thermostats, and electric blankets with Bluetooth controls. And yet, the old warmers aren't gone. They just changed rooms. Quirky tidbit? In a delightful twist of domestic evolution, some old warming pans have been repurposed as serving trays, flower planters, even mail holders. One Victorian warming pan was found in a Devon pub, turned upside down and mounted as a ceiling light fixture. The bartender said it gave a lovely amber glow, like it's still warming someone's toes. Meanwhile, a few museums have curated entire exhibits around Victorian warmth. The Museum of English Rural Life once ran a display called Comforts of the Hearth, which included an interactive warmth station where visitors could compare a faux warming pan to a faux rubber bottle. Children reportedly preferred the ceramic bottle, less metal, more huggable. And yes, they still giggled at the word bedpan. Historians still argue whether nostalgia for these items is truly about the object, or the quiet routines they symbolize. Maybe it's about the care involved. Someone boiling the water while you brushed your teeth. Someone sliding it between cold sheets before you even arrived. Someone checking, gently, to make sure it wasn't leaking. It's not just heat, it's thoughtfulness, passed hand to hand, night after night. And so, here you are. Tucked into your own bed, long past the age of warming pans, but maybe not so far from the impulse that created them. That old desire for softness, for warmth, for something glowing quietly beside you in the dark. As your thoughts drift, you might imagine yourself in a quiet Victorian bedroom, dim candlelight flickering, the bed slightly creaky, a stone jug nestled near your feet. You wriggle your toes toward it. It's just the right temperature. Not too hot. Not too cold. And everything else, the drafts, the day, the world, melts away. You are warm. You are safe. And with that, we'll ease into the soft wind down, letting the warmth linger just a little longer. Now, everything begins to quiet. The fire in the grate has long since died down, but its glow still dances on the walls of memory. The embers of Victorian evenings, tea in thin porcelain cups, the faint rustle of slippers on wooden floors, the careful handling of warm jugs wrapped in wool, settle into a comfortable hush. Even the house, that old creaky creature, has fallen still. No footsteps. No water boiling. Just the kind of silence that presses gently on your ears and tells you, without words, that the day is done. The room is dim now, and the bed is soft beneath you. Your body, once curled and alert, stretches gently into rest. Every breath is slower. Every muscle begins to melt. That spot at your toes? Still warm, still perfect, like the phantom touch of a warming jug placed with care just before you slipped under the covers. You don't need to move. You don't need to think. All that's left to do is float. Float through woolen quilts and coal smoke and whispered bedtime rituals. Float through the cozy corners of a time long gone, where even the coldest nights could be tamed with a little hot water and a lot of love. So let your eyes grow heavy. Let your mind go quiet. And if you dream tonight, may it be of brass pans glowing by firelight, stone bottles lined up on a nursery shelf, and the simple joy of slipping into a bed that someone, somewhere, took the time to make warm just for you. Good night.